Have you ever felt like there's got to be more to things than we're told? Like the explanations we get are just scratching the surface.
Hmm.
Like we're searching for a more solid understanding of, like everything.
Yeah, that's a really fundamental human drive,
Hmm.
that yearning to question to get to the bottom of things.
Absolutely. And that is exactly why we are taking a deep dive into the world of René Descartes, a philosopher who wrestled with those same questions centuries ago.
Hmm. A pivotal figure in the history of thought, for sure.
Exactly. We're zeroing in on his Discourse on Method, a pretty short but incredibly influential work. It laid the groundwork for a lot of modern philosophy and even science, too.
It's like a manifesto, you could say, for a whole new way of thinking.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. René Descartes, born in 1596, lived until 1650. He wasn't some ivory tower academic, though his family had ties to both medicine and commerce.
Oh, interesting.
So he would have been exposed to some pretty practical realities. What jumps out at you about that background?
Well, I think it suggests that he wouldn't have been content with just abstract theories. His upbringing probably instilled a certain pragmatism in him.
Makes sense. Now, he was a pretty frail kid growing up, which meant he got a lot of attention early on. Eventually, he attended the Jesuit College of La Flèche, a pretty significant institution back then.
La Flèche, yeah, it was known for providing a very rigorous education steeped in the scholastic tradition.
And for our listeners who might not be familiar with that term, what exactly is scholastic philosophy?
So scholastic philosophy was like the dominant intellectual system in medieval universities.
Mm.
It was heavily influenced by Aristotle and focused a lot on applying logical reasoning to theology and philosophy.
Gotcha. So he's immersed in all this established knowledge. He was a good student, too, by all accounts. And here's the interesting part. Even though he excelled in this system, he still felt like something was missing. He didn't find that bedrock of truth, the kind of certainty that he was looking for.
It makes you wonder why he found it so unsatisfying, doesn't it? You have to remember the historical context. This was during the Renaissance, a time of massive intellectual upheaval. The spirit of innovation was clashing head-on with these traditional modes of thought.
Right.
And Descartes, with his love for the precision of mathematics, probably found the scholastic approach frustrating.
Yeah.
All that circular reasoning and lack of grounding in real-world observations.
Yeah, it's like he could see how math could deliver these clear, undeniable answers.
Exactly. Mathematics offered a clarity, a demonstrability that seemed to be missing from other areas of knowledge.
Totally. And despite later recommending La Flèche to others, Descartes himself left feeling disillusioned.
Can you imagine that? Going through this prestigious education and still feeling like something's just not quite right.
Yeah, like some fundamental piece of the puzzle is still missing. So where does he go from there?
Well, he ends up studying law at the University of Poitiers, gets his degree,
Yeah.
but that doesn't satisfy his intellectual hunger either.
And then he makes a really unexpected move, almost like something out of a movie. He joins the Dutch army.
Yeah, it just goes to show you that even these brilliant thinkers can have these really surprising life experiences.
For sure. Serving in the army under Maurice of Nassau against the Spanish must have exposed him to a whole different side of reality. But it's clear that his mind remained his primary battleground.
Absolutely. And during his time in the army, he forms this close friendship with Isaac Beeckman, a Dutch physician who was really into physics and mathematics.
How important do you think that relationship was for Descartes?
Oh, I think it was crucial. Beeckman shared Descartes' passion for finding a more mathematically sound explanation for how the world worked. That intellectual companionship must have been so stimulating for Descartes.
Yeah, like having a sounding board to bounce ideas off of.
Exactly. Someone who encouraged his explorations and helped him develop his own ideas.
Okay, now here's where things get really interesting. It's late 1619. Descartes is alone in a heated room.
Oh, wow.
Imagine the scene, the isolation, maybe the intensity of his own thoughts just swirling around him. And in this moment, he has this profound intellectual breakthrough.
Like a lightning bolt.
It's a revelation about the very foundation of a universal science. He felt like he'd glimpsed the underlying structure of how all knowledge could be built. This experience led him to make a big decision. He decided to travel and seek truth not just in books, but in what he called the great book of the world.
Essentially shifting from relying solely on what's written down to valuing firsthand experience.
Right, like a core principle of the emerging scientific revolution.
Exactly.
So he starts working on this ambitious project called Treatise on the World and on Man. It laid out his scientific views, but then a major event rocks the intellectual community, the condemnation of Galileo.
And of course, the activities of the Inquisition were no secret.
It was a dangerous time to be challenging established doctrines, especially in the realm of science.
Absolutely. Giordano Bruno had been burned at the stake just decades earlier, and Tommaso Campanella had been imprisoned for his views.
The church held immense power back then.
It really puts things into perspective.
So Descartes, being very aware of this climate, decides not to publish his treatise. Can you imagine having these groundbreaking ideas and choosing to keep them quiet out of fear?
It really highlights the tension that can exist between intellectual progress and societal pressures. He essentially chose his own safety and the potential for future work over immediate recognition.
A pragmatic choice in a dangerous time.
Definitely.
Okay, so this brings us to the heart of what we want to explore today. Descartes' central philosophical project as he lays it out in Discourse on Method. We're talking about his belief in the power of human reason and the idea that science can be built on a solid, independent foundation.
This is essentially the birth of modern rationalism.
Exactly, the idea that reason is the primary source of knowledge. So after following Descartes on this journey, let's break down some key takeaways from Discourse on Method. What are the most fundamental shifts he's proposing?
Well, first, there's his deep dissatisfaction with the traditional learning he received. He saw its limitations, how it failed to provide the certain knowledge he was looking for. And this is what spurred him to seek out a new method.
And a key element of that new method was the importance he placed on mathematical reasoning.
Right, that clarity and step-by-step logical progression that math offers. He saw it as a model for how all reasoning should work, emphasizing the importance of clear and distinct ideas. This led him to develop his famous 4 rules of method.
These rules are so important. Can we go over them one more time just to really cement them?
Sure.
The first rule: never accept anything as true unless it's so clear and distinct to your mind that you have absolutely no reason to doubt it. The second rule: break down every problem into as many smaller parts as possible to make it easier to solve. Third: conduct your thoughts in a specific order, starting with the simplest and easiest objects to understand, and gradually building up to knowledge of the more complex things. And finally, the fourth rule: make sure your enumerations and reviews are so comprehensive that nothing is left out.
Essentially, a systematic and rigorous approach to building knowledge from the ground up, ensuring certainty at every step.
And it's interesting that while he was developing this rigorous method for attaining knowledge, he also acknowledged the need for what he called a provisional morality, like a set of guiding principles to follow while he was still in the process of doubting and rebuilding his beliefs.
Right? He wasn't suggesting we all just descend into chaos while questioning everything. He provided a framework for living and acting in the meantime.
A very practical consideration.
It shows that he was concerned with the real-world implications of his philosophical ideas. He understood that we have to make decisions and take action even while we're engaged in deep intellectual questioning.
Which leads us to his most famous statement, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am.
The cornerstone of his entire philosophical system, the one unshakable truth that remains even in the face of extreme doubt.
So what makes this statement so powerful for him?
Well, even if he doubted everything else, the existence of the external world, the reliability of his senses, the very act of doubting proved that he was thinking.
He couldn't deny that.
And for Descartes, thinking encompasses all forms of conscious awareness, not just intellectual reasoning. So this statement establishes the thinking subject as the undeniable starting point for all knowledge.
From there, he goes on to develop his concept of dualism.
The idea that the mind and body are distinct substances, a view that's had a huge and lasting impact on philosophy and even neuroscience, though it's still debated and challenged today.
Then he delves into arguments for the existence of God. What role does God play in his philosophical system?
For Descartes, God is a perfect being, and crucially the guarantor of both the external world and the reliability of our perceptions. He argued that without a benevolent God, we could be constantly deceived, and all our efforts to gain knowledge would be pointless.
He also makes a distinction between different types of ideas, innate, factitious, and adventitious. Can you break those down for us?
Okay, so innate ideas are those that seem to be part of our very nature, not derived from experience. Factitious ideas are the ones we create ourselves through our imagination. And adventitious ideas are those that come to us from the outside world through our senses.
So how did he understand our knowledge of the external world based on these different types of ideas?
He believed that we can know the external world, especially its quantifiable properties like size, shape, and motion, through reason and mathematics. Our senses provide us with qualities like color and taste, but those are seen as more subjective. Interestingly, he also developed a very mechanistic view of animals and even the human body. He saw them as complex machines or automata controlled by the soul through a specific gland in the brain.
Viewing living beings as machines, that's a pretty radical idea for his time.
Yeah, it was a big departure from the prevailing Aristotelian views, which emphasized these inherent vital forces. Descartes' mechanistic perspective really paved the way for a more scientific and less mystical understanding of biology, although his exclusion of animals from the realm of consciousness is still a point of contention.
It is, but ultimately, Descartes' big contribution was to champion the power of human reason as the primary tool for understanding the world, moving away from the reliance on tradition and authority that characterized scholastic thought. That's why he's often called the father of modern philosophy.
He really empowered the individual intellect, emphasizing the importance of critical thinking and methodical inquiry in our pursuit of knowledge.
So as we wrap up, think about Descartes' emphasis on rigorous self-examination and methodical doubt. How does that apply to how we approach information in our own lives today? What beliefs or assumptions do we hold that might benefit from that kind of scrutiny? And what new understandings might we reach if we applied his method to the information we encounter daily? It's a challenge to think more deeply about how we know what we think we know.
Absolutely. It's a legacy that continues to push us to be more rigorous and independent in our thinking, to constantly question and seek a more solid foundation for our beliefs.
And that's a wrap for a deep dive into René Descartes and his discourse on method. Until next time, keep those minds questioning.
And keep seeking those deeper truths.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.